Good afternoon, morning. I'm so glad to see all of you here. We're going to get started. We have this amazing speaker, Genisis Wilson. She is the vice president of the Black Student Union here on campus. And me and Miriam were just both so personally impacted by her just really motivating and moving speaking abilities and storytelling at the Black Student Union banquet that we knew we had to have her because we knew her messaging was so important to share with all of you. So I really hope you're able to take something away today, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. As she said, my name is Genisis Wilson, and today our Times talk is going to be called Why DEI? I basically wanted to start this out with why you guys should listen to me today and just give you a little bit of background on who I am. So I am a biology pre-health major, getting a chemistry minor. I'm a sophomore, and I'm the vice president of the Black Student Union. I'm in the Young Dems, pre-med club, and Women in STEM. Some things I've done this year that kind of go into public speaking is I debated in the annual Young Dems versus College Republican debate we have on campus every year. I went to Black Legislative Day 2024 at our Capitol, spoke to some representatives. It was really cool. I can't wait to go back. And I co-organized a local protest we had here last month. Activism is something that is really, really important to me, and I like to show it through the extracurricular activities I get to do and also tie it back to what I want to do. I also have given this kind of DEI talk reformed 2 other times at the Black Student Union's annual Black History Month banquet and to some sororities on campus, and looking forward to doing some more. My mission here today is to talk to you guys about why we need things like DEI, but also talk to you about some African American struggle. My long-term goals are to be able to become an ER doctor and start a nonprofit that helps children that are in situations that involve addiction and abuse. I grew up in that kind of home and that kind of lifestyle, and I just want to make sure I can give back and do something good. So in today's presentation, we kind of have 3 parts to it. We're going to be talking about the past. So are we downplaying African American history? And then who benefits from single-dimensional Black historical figures? We'll move on to kind of present. Why is this affecting us? Why do we need DEI? What is happening to us right now? Mainly we'll go into healthcare disparities because I love talking about the things I want to do. Then we'll get into the future, where we'll talk about why Black history is important for our future, why we have to think about the past and correct for it to get to where we want to be. And then the whole point of this, why is DEI important and how will it help? Before we get into it, you'll see already that this is very heavily based on African American experience. But when we're thinking about DEI, that goes into all marginalized communities, Hispanic, Asian, any marginalized community, people with disabilities, and also our LGBTQ plus community. So even though my talk today is just going to be mainly based on this, it applies to every part. Every statistic brought up, you can see it in favor for other marginalized communities, and we have to think about it as a whole problem for everybody. So our first part of this is our past. I like to call it misguided history because sometimes other ways of wording it, as we'll see, can be trigger words which make people not want to talk about this or not want to get into these subjects. Throughout history, we have heard all of these anecdotal lined history points of Black figures. We hear about MLK and how he just wanted peaceful protests and how his ideology got us to where we are today. We don't hear a lot about his background of being a socialist. We don't hear a lot about how he wanted all of these social programs because they don't fit the current agenda that a lot of people want to push. If we think about African Americans and our history as being so radical, we won't have the agenda that people want. African Americans' contribution to building of America has been downplayed, so we could continue to be enslaved and thought of as less. If you take the main ideas that you want to point out and separate it from these people as a whole, you are able to keep people down and make sure that organizations aren't happening. This retelling of history to belittle African Americans is often called whitewashing. That is my trigger word that I don't exactly like to use and prefer misguided history so that people don't have to feel a sense of guilt every time we talk about this. At the end of the day, calling it whitewashing does put some emphasis on our white counterparts where it could stop a conversation. And it's not that they don't want to have these conversations, but being ridden with guilt doesn't make the conversation easy. By downplaying the radicalism of Black historical figures, their challenges to systemic racism are softened, making it seem like progress is always smooth and inevitable. Like I said before, if we put them as not so radical and only one-dimensional, we are able to say it is one special person who got up here and changed history. It takes a specific kind of person to do this, when in reality, it is a community, it is a group, and it is all the time. It's not specific points of history that's the right time, it's every day. And if we all think of ourselves as accountable and all think of ourselves as a part of a movement, we're gonna be able to get things done. The next thing I'll talk about is about 3 historical figures where we're gonna learn something deeper. We're gonna make them more than one-dimensional. And I just ask that if you learn anything new from anything I talk about today in this next section, that you understand there is something missing and something we need to make up for. And if you do believe that there's something missing in this next part and there's something we need to make up for, then you should also believe that we need something like DEI to fill those gaps. Our first historical figure we'll talk about is George Washington Carver. He's most widely known as the guy who created peanut butter, but that's actually not true. He was an American agricultural scientist who invented and promoted alternative crops to cotton and methods to prevent soil depletion. After cotton was a cash crop in our South, it depleted the soil, caused erosion, and made sure that other things could not live and grow there. When we had that, we were going to fail in the agricultural system, but we had people like George Washington Carver who found solutions and are detrimental to the agricultural system we have today. He developed hundreds of products using peanuts, although not peanut butter, and sweet potatoes and soybeans. He brought these things here and showed us how to cultivate them and what agricultural things we needed to make these crops in the South to make sure that we had a bustling agricultural system. But if we just think of him as a guy who created peanut butter, we don't have to look at how important he was to our history or everything he went through after and before that. Because George Washington Carver was born into slavery. When he was about 13, he became a freed person and he moved here to Kansas. So it's also relevant to Kansas history. He graduated from Minneapolis High School and even applied for Highland Community College, and he was initially accepted until they figured out his race, where he was promptly rejected from the school and went on to go to schools like Howard, one of our first historical Black colleges. After he went to this college, he became the first African American to earn a Bachelor's of Science degree. He did so much for not only agriculture, but for science and for Black people as a whole, and he had a support system behind him at Howard and all of the things he did with science. And we have to look at him as not one-dimensional. Thinking of him as something that's not even his past, making peanut butter, is putting him down and making sure that we don't thank African Americans and our history for what they've built here in America. Our next person is Harriet Tubman, another really well-known one. Her history that we do know is mostly true, which is good, unlike our past one, where we only think about her as working in the Underground Railroad. She does get a lot more recognition than a lot of others because we do know she made several trips, but what people don't ever think about is how she was instrumental in us winning the Civil War for the Union. She was a spy for the Union, and she also did a lot of work with women's suffrage. And during all of this and after, she struggled with PTSD, narcolepsy, and poverty. As we get down in here, we'll learn that she asked to be paid for being a spy after she was employed by the US federal government, but Congress denied her payment due to the color of her skin. She gave her whole life for philanthropy. She spent her whole life trying to uplift African Americans and women, and she struggled because of it. When we don't think about everything the US government did to her personally or everything she did for us, we're again just using one part of her to push a narrative that she only did nice, docile work, went into the Underground Railroads, freed slaves, and she was just such a character we should look up to. But what we don't think about is everything behind that. In 1896, she co-founded the National Association of Colored Women, which fought for suffrage and equality for African American women. Another thing that we don't think about is that she was right next to Susan B. Anthony during the whole women's suffrage movement. She went around, traveled the country giving speeches and fighting, but for our women's suffrage movement, it was not a good look to have a black woman as the face of it. And so she had to go and start her own associations to fight for the rights of African American women. Harriet Tubman opened the Harriet Tubman Home for Aged and Indigenous Colored People in 1896 and established freed black schools. She also sold her own homegrown produce, raised pigs, and accepted donations for her philanthropy. During all this, when she was poor and she didn't have any money and she could not afford to live or to get treatment for anything that she had, she was always giving back to the community and making sure that everybody had anything that they needed. Today, if you learned anything, like I said, about Harriet Tubman through any of this, you have to understand there's a gap in our education. We are being taught one singular thing about these African American heroes, and that is being used to push an agenda that we know enough about them and we know the good things that we want to talk about. Our next one is a lot lesser known. His name is Dr. Charles Drew, but he means a lot to me personally because he's a pioneer for African Americans in the medical field. He's most well known for the inventor of blood banks, where he separated blood and plasma and created ways to store them. Dr. Charles Drew is a very not well-known name when he has saved billions of people worldwide. He's saving people as we are talking through his whole life with this invention. Not only that, he was the first African American to be appointed as a medical examiner for the American Board of Surgery. He was skilled in everything he did, and while doing all of these things, facing all these barriers to become everything he became, he was also advocating for African Americans in the healthcare field, advocating for them to get through. When we learn about him, we don't learn about how, as soon as he made his invention and America saw how amazing it was, they took it, they ran with it, they used it, and they segregated it. White blood and black blood were separated along with other minorities because they could not be put together or given to the opposite race. He spent the rest of his life basically conducting research to prove that there were no difference between any of these bloods and that you could not tell who they were from based on their race. And he advocated, but they still told him no. When we look at his history again, we're just looking at how he's the inventor of blood banks and not that everything that was done to him, and not looking at how much he suffered from doing something so good for our country and for the world overall. Our next portion is going to be getting kind of more into the present struggles. So we just went through our African American history. We learned that we're not being told the whole truth. We're not giving the resources to look into them. And we're only learning one part of these historical figures. So does that still affect us today? If we need DEI to learn about the past, how can we use it for the future? When I like to talk about African American struggles when they pertain to the year of 2025, it normally has something to do with healthcare or our industrial prison complex. For today's talk, we will just go through healthcare and not so much in the prison system, but you can see it there where we have African Americans who are disproportionately imprisoned and over-policed and given higher sentences for the same crimes as their white counterparts. But all of the things we'll talk about today are healthcare related, and they're very present and they're very, very recent. Everything in here comes from studies no later than 2017, and mostly from the NIH, our National Institute of Health. We have seen that African Americans have higher uninsured rates till this day than their white counterparts. They're more likely to go without health care due to this, due to the cost of insurance and health care. And we also see that they have worse reported health statuses. If we look at the figure over here, it gives you kind of a rundown of black versus white on these. This was just done a little smaller of a study, but it was looked at between 2017 and 2019, and we also see that African Americans have life expectancy that is nearly 5 years shorter than their white counterparts. medically speaking, there is not a difference between a white and a black person. There is no such thing as a black person's blood coagulating more quickly. They don't have higher pain tolerances. They don't have thicker skin. None of these things are true. And if there is no difference, why is it that we have almost a 5-year gap between these races? It has to do with everything systemically that black people have been through in the past 400 years. It has to do with being at lower socioeconomic statuses, less access to healthcare. It has to do with them being scareder to go to healthcare professionals due to all of the mistreatment that they have received. Black infants have a higher infant mortality rate at 39.9 per 100,000 live births versus their white counterparts with 14.1. That is almost 2.5 times higher that black babies die during birth than their white counterparts. Again, we could think about what could this be due to. Black people not going to the hospitals like they should for proper checkup and proper care to get properly screened because of their mistrust in our healthcare system. We have people in our healthcare system who will look at them and ignore their pain tolerances and their pain rates because they think it must be higher. As recently as 2016, a study found that continued widespread beliefs among white medical students, residents, and lay people they believe in biological differences between black and white people. Like I said, including believing black people have thicker skin than white people and that their blood coagulates more quickly. This is a study done through the NIH. As recently as 2016, we have found these biases still in our healthcare system. So black people's mistrust in our healthcare system is very real, very much still alive, and we are seeing statistics like this that are proving that point, that they're not getting the healthcare that they need and they're not being seen. Like I said, historical and ongoing experiences of discrimination and mistrust can lead to reluctance to seek healthcare. If we continue to not close these gaps and to show studies that show that people still think lesser than or differently of African Americans, we are putting them in a place to still feel this mistrust and to not get the healthcare that they need, or when they seek the healthcare that they need, to not get their problems and issues solved. Structural racism leads to people from ethnic minority backgrounds having poorer health outcomes. Like I said, when they go there, their pain is ignored, and we have even as recently people stating that they need different vaccine schedules. We have to understand that black people do not have any health differences than white people biologically, and that this is all caused by their socioeconomic status and structural racism. Another study that I looked at showed that pandemic workers found that doctors from ethnic minority backgrounds were more likely to feel pressured to work without adequate PPE by their supervisors, and that they felt they could not stand up and say anything about it as risk of being fired and risk of being looked at differently. The constant fear of something happening to you because of the color of your skin is something embedded into African Americans' minds. When we get into work and we're asked to do something a little bit unsafe, they're more likely to go along with it because they think that it's going to help them out in the long run. But as we saw, African Americans disproportionately died from COVID-19, especially in the healthcare force. The struggle of African Americans is very present and very real today. No, they are not enslaved, and no active segregation is not happening. But when we look at these statistics, there is nothing else we can cause or we can blame it on. It can be blamed on socioeconomic status, but we can tie that right back into structural racism. So I just gave you guys a little bit of a speech about everything black people go through, and it's like we feel bad, but like sometimes you need a little bit of benefit to make you really get that push. So how does diversity help us? How does implementing DEI to close the gap for African Americans in healthcare and in history help us, everybody as a whole, not just African Americans? Well, companies with diverse ethnic backgrounds are 35% more likely to have financial performance above the national industry median. We see it around the board. that performance and financial performance is up with a more diverse leadership and workforce. Diverse companies are 70% more likely to capture new markets, Harvard Business Review says. When we think about this, you can be like, that's a lot of people they're reaching. My favorite thing to bring it back to is makeup companies. If you imagine a makeup company being ran by all men and having only men on the board, how many people are they going to be able to reach in a market that is predominantly women? If you have people on your staff creating new ideas that wear makeup, that use makeup, that live as a woman every day, you are going to have more innovative ideas for this field, and you're going to be able to reach the markets that actually want to buy these products. So if we have more diverse people in these companies, not just women of darker complexions who have to go into stores every day and not find their shade, if we look at these things, we'll be able to have more creative ideas and reach more markets. This goes further than makeup. It goes everywhere from education to any type of company you can think about. If there is more diverse people there, they're reaching more markets, they understand more people, they're getting more revenue. Companies that reported above average diversity on their market teams also reported innovation revenue that was 19 percentage points higher than the companies with below average leadership. That is this figure over here. If we look at below average diversity leadership, we see that they are just about a 26% when it comes to innovation revenue reported. If we look at people in the green with above average diversity scores in their leadership, they're about a 45% innovation revenue reported. That is 19 percentage points between the two. That is a huge gap that could be closed with DEI. If we have proper practices in place to make sure our workplace is diverse, you will have higher innovation revenue. Our last one statistic with this is a little far-fetched, but in a full potential scenario, which women play an identical role in labor markets that men do, as much as 28 trillion or 26% could be added to the global annual GDP by 2025. This is a little bit of an older statistic. It is from 2018, but it's saying in just those 7 years, we could have 28 trillion or 26% added to our annual GDP if we just had an equal workforce with men and women. That doesn't even go into race, where there's not as many black people in America as there is white people, but women and men make up a pretty even majority, or a majority. And so if we just had a labor market that was equal, our GDP would go up. Every place we look at and everywhere we look, whether it's revenue, innovation, or GDP, having it more diverse and more people there overall puts us higher in every sector. This includes education. If we have more diverse teachers and more diverse staffing in that, we will learn more and we will have more people to talk about their unique experiences. So, the whole point of this is why DEI? Why do we need diversity, equity, and inclusion policies in education, in healthcare, and in our companies? Well, it's all about fostering an environment where innovation, inclusion, and equity drive growth and success. It's all about making sure that everybody feels welcome and included in where they're at. And it's all about making sure your companies, your schools, and our healthcare system are making as much money as they can, making people as happy as they can be, and making our society more fair and just. DEI remains one of the most important strategies, like I said, for creating a fairer and more just society. If you ever hear anything I talk about or think about, all of this really sucks and all of those statistics made me really sad, one way to improve those statistics, to improve people's lives, to improve how you're feeling right now, is to promote DEI, to promote training people on these topics, to promote sensitivity training to make sure that people feel safe where they're at, and to promote learning these kinds of things before I have to talk to you about them. Learning that systemic racism still faces us today and affects us. Centuries of slavery, segregation, and systemic racism have left lasting scars on the Black communities. DEI policies address their long-standing disparities by leveling these playing fields in education, employment, healthcare, and more. If we want to look at any type of paper written on this or anything looking at DEI, overall, it puts people at an equal playing field. It puts people in a place that we have never been before in America. With our history that we talked about at the beginning and how you guys are still learning new things about these really, really famous Black historical figures. If you learned anything about MLK when I said in the beginning how he was a socialist or he believed that we should have social programs for everybody to help us, if you learned something about one of our biggest faces, there is a gap that needs to be filled. If you learned today that systemic racism still affects Black people and that Black babies have a higher mortality rate, or that Black people feel pressured in work to do things that maybe they wouldn't regularly do at risk of losing their job or being seen as different, there's a gap that needs to be closed. If everything I said today makes you think just a little bit, there's a gap that needs to be closed that DEI could solve. Proper training in all of these sectors could solve these issues. The removal of DEI could be seen as a step backwards for society. Undoing policies established in the 1960s may erase decades of progress towards equality. When we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 signed in and we started making feats towards equality and desegregation, it was very important to also put DEI into these programs. It was important to make sure that we were continuously leading and learning and talking about these issues so that they could get solved. And stopping them right now, 60 years after they were put into place, is not enough. And all it is going to do is push us right back to where we were before these protections were put into place. So, how do we reap these benefits? How do we feel a little better in our day-to-day lives about all of these things? Because it's not like any of you can overturn any executive orders about DEI or make Fort Hays do DEI. Well, we can align our company's missions and values with DEI, your personal values, the groups you're in with DEI. You can do more research and you can teach others. It's really odd sometimes to have to always be the person to talk about things, but it doesn't always have to be a whole conversation. You can just make sure when you look around at who's leading these groups and who's talking about these things, that they just make sure they have different people amongst them. And if they don't have different people in that group, that you speak up for those marginalized communities in that conversation. You think, what would someone who isn't white or who isn't straight, who isn't this part of this one group say to this? If it ever feels a little funny what somebody's saying, you go and you ask them a question. Why do you think that? Why are you saying that? We need to set clear and measurable goals and objectives for ourselves. We can't solve this all individually. Everything is a community effort. Everything involves organizing. Everything MLK ever did revolved around the community behind him. Everything Harriet Tubman and George Washington Carver and Dr. Charles Drew did, everybody needed a community behind them, and everybody did it as a group. There's not one heroic person who can complete and do all of these things. We have to have embedded DEI into all aspects of our lifestyle. It just goes into checking the way you think and thinking to yourself, is this speaking up for a marginalized community? You need to have measurable progress and hold leaders accountable. You need to make sure that everybody around you who is speaking for you, who is speaking for our campus, our communities, are speaking a correct message, are making sure that what these people were putting up on a pedestal revolve around our beliefs. And if they don't, you have to speak up. Like I said, speak up for those around you and go to events like this and show your support. Go to the groups that you might not normally go to or that you don't fit into to show your support and to show that you are here with them in such a time. These days, especially for the Black Student Union, have been a little bit on the darker side. We had a lot of the executive orders about DEI come out right before and during Black History Month, and thinking, are we going to be able to do the same events that we want to do? Are we going to be able to use funds to do these things? Are we going to be able to be a Black student union? It's very hard to be a Black student union without diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's kind of our whole message. It's kind of the whole point. We join together and we talk about social issues. We talk about them at our banquets, at our hair care events. It's a common topic and it's a common practice. And so having people who also show that they support us and show that they support these things can always help us build a community to be able to fight back and to be able to talk back. We are so thankful that I get to talk about this today, or that we got to talk about all of these things during Black History Month. We got to still have our banquet. We get to still have funding. We're glad that it's not affecting us yet. But when it does affect us, we have to know that there's a community behind us. So to wrap everything up, before I take questions or anything, I just want to make sure that it gets through that diversity, equity, and inclusion only helps us. Not only does it help build up the most marginalized people in our society, it helps everybody across the board. It helps our companies, it helps our GDP. It helps us in such a way that I'm barely able to say. We need DEI, we need these things to fill these gaps, and we need to make sure that we have an active community behind us. And with that, my presentation's over. Thank you. So, if anybody has any questions or anything like that, you guys are able to ask them now. Yes.
Okay, so like, what if I just meet someone on the street and they're spouting like, oh, DEI, whatever, and like all these like this misinformation? How can I like start that conversation to be like, wait, pause, let me talk? Like, what's a simple phrase I can say, or a few sentences, or like something that's like would really make an impact to them?
Yeah. I feel like if somebody, I've had to realize with a lot of the conversations I have, if somebody's outwardly talking negatively about DEI or about these things, lots of times they're not looking for a conversation. They're not looking to have their mind changed. So sometimes it's better not to speak. I found that a lot of the time there's people who's like, what is DEI? What is going on here? Those people are a lot more receptive. But if somebody's like, yeah, I'm so glad DEI is being taken down. I'm so glad this is happening. Maybe saying something like, why do you think that way? I think one good thing with people who are angry and who have an opinion on something already, a good thing to ask them is why. It starts to get their ideas and break them down. And if their ideas are not based in any sort of logic, it's easily taken down and be able to talk about. And sometimes they don't want a further conversation and it'll be over. But if you ask them why and you bring up like, I have never seen a problem with DEI. One of my favorite things to do in passing conversations, like, I've never seen a problem with it. And just that little bit of pushback with confidence, people go, oh, okay, like, I don't want to have this conversation anymore. Just confidence and pushback.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I've been in a number of meetings recently where people have proposed changing language, either language in some kind of belongs to diversity, equity, and inclusion research institute in school education, and we thought we were going to need to change our name. There's another bit of work in preparing teachers and using kind of the standards that also address diversity. We all thought, should we take up, like, we're all reacting, I fear, when I hope we don't ever need to amend the language in those documents, but people are like, they want to almost proactively like take those things out. And in the moment in that meeting, my first reaction is generally not very favorable to those suggestions, and so I have to like, I can't get my language together quickly enough to respond in a way that is maybe helpful and not just like, what are you talking about? Like, because I get really angry at it, and so I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and just like how we might like recognize our fear, but also work beyond it.
Yeah. No, I definitely understand that. The Black Student Union had a lot of conversation like that where it's immediate, like, okay, well, what can we word with not making it diversity, equity, inclusion? What can we word this away from that? So it's conversations that me and the president of the Black Student Union, Starlet Parham, had where we're like, how can we talk about this without saying DEI? So sometimes those conversations are good. We have to make sure those conversations aren't that we want to suppress DEI and end it, but that we also think about it's a scary, scary time, but there are people behind you. There are people who agree with you, especially coming to Hayes, Kansas, going to school here and meeting people. It was really hard because I was like, no one's gonna share the same beliefs as me. No one's gonna understand me. It's gonna be a constant argument every single day. But I found those people. I've joined those groups with people behind me. I think in a time where you're so scared about everything, I like to think about how scared our past African Americans were when they had to march in Selma and the Capitol and bus boycott, and how they would actively lose their jobs, lives, etc. And they still went and did it. So how scary could it be for me at the end of the day? But it's a really hard time having these conversations. It's a really hard time living in a society that you don't think is going to accept you, or the words you want to use, or the people you want to uplift. And there's no real good answer to it. I think I was blessed a little bit with my speaking ability when it comes to conversations with people. I'm able to have calm conversations and not get angry, but I have a lot of friends who always ask me, they're like, Genesis, when they say something really, really dumb like this, what am I supposed to say without getting angry and calling them names and doing this and doing that? And I always just try to bring it into breaking down their beliefs, like I said before, asking why we're doing this. And when you get down to the core of these beliefs or the core of what we're doing, if there's no basis of it, it'll get swept away quickly. So if we go, why are we changing this language? What are we changing it to? Lots of times these conversations don't lead anywhere because there's no other solution but continuing to go and continuing to use the language and stand for these people.
Okay, one of the questions I have is that, I understand the civil rights struggle very well. I went to Washburn, and I understand the ground for women's education case very well. I understand all the other cases that flow from that. And I think one of the mistakes that you made with emphasis on DEI is that people with disabilities have been systematically killed by the system. Even if you go way back to the beginning of the even the ship of fools idea that was passed around Europe during the Middle Ages, they would pack a ship full of fools, and they literally take it to every port, and then they sink it after you go to the airport and sink it. Thousands of people, hundreds of people with disabilities, mental illness would die because of that, or because of the fact that the sterilization case was well. 1928, the infamous case of the Supreme Court. The whole thing is that I think DEI fails to take into account in many cases that the population with disabilities don't have jobs. They have to get into the arena of politics. They don't have to get into the arena of the job market or whatever. Between 60 and 70% of all people with disabilities are unemployed in the United States. And the problem with the DEI focus is that it doesn't necessarily flow into economic justice. DEI is a useful tool. It is not the end result of it, though.
Nope.
And I think the whole focus of this thing should be more toward economic justice as a right thing. It is not a racial thing. It is not a sexual thing. It is not a gender thing. It is an economic thing. Economics is a basis to all the systems that we flow from today.
Yeah.
Racism is economic. Sexism is economic. Gender discrimination is economic. Disability discrimination is economic. And I think the whole focus of this thing should be more an economic focus rather than just a DEI focus.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I think whenever I think about these subjects, the two main minority groups that come to my mind are people with disabilities and like immigrants, because they do not have a voice most of the time in any of these. I'm so lucky to be able to talk for the Black community, but the voice of you're not even in these sectors, these arenas yet to be able to fight for yourself. You can't even get a job in any of this. And I think that DEI is a stepping stone. Like you said, I don't think it's an end-all be-all. I believe in certain types of reparations and a lot of other things, especially towards our disabled community, because we have put them down so much and so far that where are they supposed to get up and where are they supposed to go? I think that DEI is a good stepping stone. It's a good way to open up people's mind and be like, okay, we need to be putting these things in place. And the more farther we could get, the more radical it could get, and the more we're like, okay, this is nothing. We have this giant issue, like you said, with socioeconomic status. How are we gonna solve that? I do think it's a really, really good conversation, and it is far further than this one because it is a huge issue that needs about 700 steps to get there because we're so far down. But I actually agree, and I'm happy I learned something today because I did not know a lot of that. Yeah. Kieran?
I don't have a question, but I did want to say I completely agree with your response. And I just wanted to follow it up with like a little bit of like more language around DEI. I think there is a lot of criticism of DEI. I think there's rightful criticism. I agree with you that it's definitely more of like a stepping stone than like the ultimate solution, because I think diversity, equity, and inclusion especially. This is something that I learned my first year here at Fort Hays in the trans community, is that inclusion means accommodation. And accommodation is where, that's a really important word I think that we need to use in DEI when we're talking about it. We need to learn this language and what diversity, equity, and inclusion means beyond the surface level of just seeing people of color or seeing queer people or seeing disabled people here. We need the accommodations for people like that, because I learned that when you're just throwing diverse people into a space without accommodating for them, you're not actually including them. You're just putting a bunch of people in the space. And when the systems don't change to accommodate for people, DEI is useless. So, I think that is the pitfall. You need to really hone in on that inclusion part. How do you include people? You need to accommodate for people of different experiences.
Correct.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Yeah.
You need to take the
Oh no, you're good, Kieran. It is a huge thing. Like I said at the beginning of my speech, like I am speaking from the lens that I was born with, basically. Being at the economic status I was and the family I had and being a Black woman, I don't know what it is like to be part of the LGBTQ plus community or be disabled. I don't know what it's like to have to go through those things with that lens on the world, and DEI is so much more than anything I talked about today. It is just what is closest to me and my experience. But there's so much more that needs to be done, and like you said, along with including people into things, how are we helping them become successful? If we give them nothing to become successful, I like to tie that back to when we freed the slaves, we were like, okay, you're good. They were promised 40 acres and a mule and all these other things. But the thing is, they were never given anything to succeed. Reconstruction in the South was stopped and done terribly. They were freed with nothing. And where did that get us today? So by adding all of these things, we can add as much as we want. But if we don't actually give anybody the proper tools to feel included and to continue in that, we've done nothing. We've done nothing but continue structural racism and hate against all of these groups of people. No, I agree.
What would be your take on why the DEI stuff has been like hyper removed from the current system?
Yeah. I think that is actually a really, really good question. Without leaving people out or excluding anybody, I think the reason that DEI especially is such a hot topic and a thing that people are taking out is it is something to band together with. It is something for a group of people to feel solidarity behind. The same reason while after the World Wars and after 9/11, America had so much cohesion is because we had a shared enemy. groups of people need shared enemies sometimes to come together, and I feel like with our current administration that DEI practices is that shared enemy. I think that is something to band together. It is a marketing tool. It is a way to get elected, a way to stay elected, and a way to get a group of people who have felt unseen and unheard behind you. Anything followed up to that?
I think one fallacy in the movement is they try to argue that DEI won't hurt people in power. And they may tell them that to get them on board, but power is a zero-sum game, and whites and males have enjoyed most of the power. And you know what we're seeing in the last few decades is that power in both that categories are eroding rather rapidly. And if you look at the MAGA movement, you just look out, it's white males that have said, we want to make America great again, we want to restore white male privilege. And I think this is what all it is, all about equal opportunity. If you have equal opportunity and people aren't discriminated against and the opportunities they're given for social mobility, everyone will tend to rise and there won't be groups that enjoy these advantages and you know, grouped at the top.
Yeah, I 100% agree. If you look at the statistics of voting, Black women voted 92% one way, African American men voted 80% one way, African Americans as a whole overall voted 85% one way. If we see our most marginalized people voting one way and another group voting the other way, I think it's a very big tell on where we should be looking and focusing our attention. And I agree, I hear lots of times people are like, well, DEI is not going to change too much. But if we're truly on equity and giving people equal opportunity, the power system's going to change. It's going to become more even.
In fact, I kind of had an idea. Somebody asked, what do you say to someone? Just ask them, of all the jobs you applied to, how many people you had to apply to were black? Or when you applied for school, how many black bosses have you had in your life?
I can tell you my answer for that, it's none.
All of mine have been white. So just think about that and imagine how I'm.
There we go. Okay.
The first black boss I ever had was in the Navy, and I think the military, I commend them for that, because the military is very diverse, and they give minorities and maybe less women. They're more working on that lately, but I never had a woman boss until I got to academia. But if you give people opportunity, they will succeed.
Yeah.
People fail because they haven't had a fair chance.
I agree. I'll head over here and then over here.
I want to, like, with your question that he asked, like, why do you think there's like an attacking? I think like I've seen in the past, like with the Republican Party, like they have a policy that they attack. Like before DEI, it was like Medicare and Medicaid. And like when you would ask them, like, I don't even think they know what it's for or like what the purpose or how it would benefit them, because like they would ask Republican voters, oh, like, you know, they'd say, oh, get rid of Obamacare. And then they'd be like, okay, well, what is Obamacare? And they're like, you know, that's Medicare and Medicaid, and they don't even know.
Yeah.
It's just something to attack. Like, it's something to, like what you said, it's a rallying point. It's something for them to be like, oh, you hate this too? You hate this too? Well, let's go after it.
I've had plenty of conversation where I asked people the difference between Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, and they were like, well, this one does this and this one does that, and I'm like, no, it doesn't. Yeah, it's like, they're the same thing.
Yes, I guess I want to push back on one thing.
Yes.
Because it isn't just white men. White women were surprisingly involved with their male counterparts in this.
White males and the women that love them.
But yeah, I mean, that's where, and many people were stunned by that result, given that there was a female candidate for president on the other side. So that's something that gets overlooked a lot of times.
It is.
When people focus on, I know individuals, I think that one of the things that divides people in this country, allows people in power to keep power, is an old playbook. Divide by race, not economic class. Because wealthy people don't win when you divide by economic class. Because most people are not extremely wealthy.
Yeah.
And that was a strategy that was used in the rural South when they could get poor white people to vote against their own economic interests because they were voting based on race.
Mm-hmm.
So a rich white person could get a poor white person to vote for them because of racial identity.
Yeah,
So
I
that
agree.
racial emphasis can actually work to the disadvantage of people who want what they consider to be a more socially just outcome. The other thing, there's some interesting things in the statistics. And I'd ask you to maybe take a look at this because when you show the difference in age, and this is an entirely separate topic, but there's a great disparity. And if you want to think of one place I would like to see a focus and things that really impact people's life or death situations. When you think of the progress is made in civil rights, a lot of it's like, well, first, let's stop getting people killed. Let's stop lynching. And let's get people a chance for an education. And you move through things which are, that the law can actually just do this. That's a long way away from getting some bigot to change their mind, right? But it is a policy, and it's something that can be enforced with the force of law behind it. And I think that's policing, and the fact that the disparity in death by violent crime. So it's actually, in some ways, a surprise that the gap is only like 5 years.
Yes.
When so many, you mentioned yourself already, that the disproportionate number of infant mortality, that greatly affects that overall calculation of life expectancy. Because when a person dies very young, that factor goes into aggregate. The same thing when you have young black women suffering 6 times as many deaths by firearms as white counterparts. Those young deaths really affect that. So and that's where DEI can come in handy. I know we have people on this campus who work in helping develop criminal justice programs for people. And if there's one place where you say, well, that's where the law could make a difference, if we could have those sorts of programs.
Yeah.
And as an anecdote, I'll tell you that the most racist individual I've ever known personally, when I was in high school, became a police officer. I was just horrified to think of this individual given a badge and a gun. Given every other word he said when I was in high school was very, very racist.
Yeah. I agree with your last point saying there, like the 5-year gap is an amazing place to get to. Everything I'm talking about today, where people will be like, if MLK came back today, like he would be so disappointed. I truly believe that if a lot of these historical black figures were here today, they would be amazed at how far we have come. Because as they'll all tell you, we are in it for the long haul. We are in it for the long marches to freedom. It is not fast. It is not linear. We have gotten to a place that is so amazing that I'm up here to talk about this, where the statistics are that close to how far they've been. I also would like to add that I did have a statistic in here about white women overly being helped by DEI. The largest group we see being helped by DEI practices are white women. We see it, again, like I said, watch the way we vote. White women overwhelmingly voted, or not overwhelmingly, but majority voted one way. Also, the proof is in the pudding and in the statistics. I agree with everything you said. I did take that part out because I was like, well, I have enough time, but it was in there. All of these things, everything you said is true. The biggest place I've ever seen so much conversation about your socioeconomic status is when I started getting into more like far left theory, because at the end of the day, no matter what your color is, the biggest thing is rich versus poor. And that's one reason why people want to keep certain races and types of people poor, because you can continue to oppress them. And that's why a large group of our minorities are poor. But at the end of the day, it is rich versus poor. It's just we have to also look at how disproportionately who is poor. Everything you said, though, I absolutely agree with. Yeah. Kiernan.
I have one more term to add to everyone's vocabulary. Intersectionality is like, that is kind of what is meant, I think, by combining diversity, equity, and inclusion, like the idea of diversity within structural systems such as, like rich versus poor. When we're thinking about socioeconomic class, that's a part of an intersectional identity. Intersectionality was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a black woman. And so I think, again, that goes back to DEI being a stepping stone, like you said, not the solution, because when you have diversity, equity, inclusion, you have more, like just speaking from just putting more black people into a workforce. Black people work within the black community and they share similar ideals. So then I didn't even know about the term intersectionality until I started listening to Black feminists, because it's a Black feminist theory where it started. So that's, you know, DEI, I think it's that start. It's that starting point. And so getting rid of it goes backwards, but you know, it does have its pitfalls because you have to keep growing from diversity, equity, inclusion. What comes next? Accommodation. What comes next? Intersectionality. So you're kind of just building.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you guys all for coming out here and listening to me talk and having a good conversation.
It's really cool you marked on useful sociological